This video will continue with our highlights for the textbook Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. We're picking up with Chapter 3, Literary and Social Scientific Approaches to Interpretation. When we're getting the big picture concerning alternatives in interpretation, we want to be aware of these three. First is the approach called historical grammatical analysis. This is the traditional approach, and it is the approach that our textbook will primarily advocate and train us in. The reason it's called historical grammatical is this. We're interested, first of all, in becoming familiar with historical features relative to the text. You may have already recognized this in some of the early assignments for the course. We want to pay attention to the era that the text belongs to, the world that it's describing, and secondarily, grammatical, we want to pay attention to how the text expresses its message, whether it's narrative or poetic, what are the literary devices that are at work there. That's why it's called historical and grammatical. At the same time, we want to be aware of approaches known as literary criticism and social scientific analysis. This particular chapter then will focus on those two alternative fields within which there are numerous subcategories. Let's focus first on literary criticism. Within this, we'll be talking about narrative criticism, post-structuralism or postmodernism, reader response criticism, and deconstruction. Let's focus first on narrative criticism. As the name suggests, narrative criticism is interested in portions of a text which deal with story or history. Consequently, this particular approach will operate in portions of the Bible such as the Pentateuch or Kings and Samuel or the book of Acts, the Gospels, as opposed to operating in Paul's letters or operating in the sermons of Jeremiah or the poems of the book of Psalms. Within story material, within narrative then, there are some particular aspects that a narrative critic is on the lookout for. Instead of just saying, when did it happen, or how was it expressed in terms of average devices of literary sort, they will be looking for plot. They will be looking for development of theme. They will be examining how is it that the individuals in a story, the characters, are developed, or perhaps they are not developed much at all. I hope you noticed what was commented in the section called Applications concerning David Klein's work in the Pentateuch. As he saw that the themes carried through all 5 books, it resulted in raising some serious questions concerning the documentary hypothesis. That is, was it tenable that the Pentateuch is the product of various sources having been woven or braided together? His observation of unity would raise question concerning sources, instead saying this seems to be a unified whole. Notice then that such an observation is the product of narrative criticism. Some aspects of narrative criticism may not be as useful. For example, there tends to operate among some narrative critics the assumption that ancient material purporting to describe history, present as a story, is actually fiction. That's a presumption that they bring to it. I hope you noticed what our textbook author said concerning that and the weaknesses of that presupposition. Some of the other aspects of more recent narrative criticism that are of less use to us have to do with how the author is described, whether real author, implied author, or narrator. In short then, various aspects of the discipline of narrative criticism can be of immense value, but we want to be discriminating users of this, not wholesale embracing everything that comes down the line under the heading of narrative criticism. Next, let's look at post-structuralism and postmodernism. Because postmodernism is such a broad term, it's helpful to pin down some of its characteristics. On page 126, bottom paragraph, there's a list of 7 that the authors give us, which I feel are worth articulating. They're very valuable. First, then, it tends to be characterized by an ideological pluralism, they write, in which no one religion or worldview contains absolute truth. Notice how this will affect someone who's reading the Bible if they're coming from a postmodern viewpoint. Second, the impossibility of objectivity in interpretation and the treasuring of value-laden approaches. Third, the importance of human communities in shaping ourselves and our interpretive perspectives. So looking to those around us, being aware of how those around us have affected the lens through which we view life. Number 4, a rejection of the negative modernistic evaluation of religion and spirituality. The modernistic evaluation of religion and spirituality is that if science is primary, then religion and spirituality are just figments of people's imagination. So by rejecting this modernistic evaluation of religion, postmodernism is more receptive to the idea of spirituality and religion. That's actually a positive, isn't it? It means that when we engage conversations about spirituality in a postmodern setting, we're going to find our audience more receptive to it than we would have in a strictly modern era. Number 5, emphasis on the aesthetic, symbolic, and ancient tradition. Are you noticing how in secular media there is a great interest in old religions, not just Christianity? In fact, generally there is a rejection of Christianity, but if you want to look into the historical backgrounds of Buddhism or some other understandings, other spiritual worldviews, there's a great fascination with that. That's characteristic of the postmodern era. Number 6, the formative role of narrative in understanding our own life pilgrimages and those of others, along with rejection of any overarching meta-narrative that can give meaning to all individual stories. Here it's not difficult to recognize an appetite in the world around us for story. We're seeing it in marketing. You can pick up a box of tea bags, and on the back of it will be the story of the company that is producing these tea bags, or the story of a tennis shoe, or the story of an actor or a member of the community. We're not just presenting skills, a facade that's strictly professional, but there's much interest in story, in narrative. At the same time, a rejection of meta-narrative. That means if someone comes along and says, okay, we may all have our stories, but actually there is a meaning in existence that reaches above and beyond all of us individuals, and we fit into it, well, that seems too narrow, and so people are inclined to reject that. Rather, they would embrace a kind of a worldview that says all roads lead to Rome. Doesn't matter which road you're traveling, eventually you'll get to a good end. It seems like the message of the Bible is a bit more exclusive than that. And number 7, language as determinative of thought and meaning. Won't pause to develop that one, but hopefully this list of 7, I think you'll find it valuable, as I have, in trying to get a handle on what can be a very nebulous concept that is postmodernism. Let's consider next reader response criticism as a subset in the general heading of post-structuralism or postmodernism. I trust you noticed on page 128 towards the top in the chart the little snippet, the brief definition of reader response criticism. And I'm quoting here, it claims that meaning, that is, meaning of the text, is the product, that is the outcome, the result of individual readers. That's you or I as we encounter and read the text. In interaction with texts, there is no objective meaning in a text itself. What they're saying then is meaning is not primarily the result of what's in the text, but rather how you encounter it, what occurs to you and myself as we encounter that. I trust that rather quickly you can detect that there are hazards in this, primarily subjectivism or relativism. What you see in a text and what I see in a text may be different. And now we're not just talking about noticing or paying attention, we're also talking about how we react to it. That's why it's reader response. What is it? What is evoked by the text in it and what stands out to us? There can be benefits in reader response. Over on page 129, bottom paragraph, they talk about gaps. And what's the idea behind this is as we're reading a story, and the example used there is David and Bathsheba, there might be questions that come to our mind. What about this? Or why isn't the story talking about this? Or I wonder if the story is emphasizing this. So places where the narrator, in writing the story, is not crystal clear. Doesn't mean it was necessarily a mistake. It may have been an intentional opacity, withholding some information so that we might wonder about it. Our wonderings then are what are called here gaps. So that can be fruitful as the reader response specialists train us to listen to the wonderings that crop up in our mind when we read a story. Sometimes those can be very informative, and it's as though the narrator was hoping we would wonder and hoping we would ponder. I'm going to switch genres for a moment, but perhaps you'll catch the link. I'm thinking about parables. Parables, part of the effectiveness of Jesus' parables is that the meaning was not always transparent. In other words, people went away saying, well, I understood what he said, but what was he driving at? They were wondering. So there was in their mind a bit of a gap, we might say. And that was a space for the person in their mind and heart to ponder and go more deeply. And in other words, if they're interested, they could press in more closely to Jesus and become a follower of his. So gaps or information withheld, sometimes on the one hand, it's just a flight of imagination. Sometimes our wonderings move us in directions that the Bible's not interested in answering. But there may be other times when we'll feel like there's information missing, and that missing information will actually become a point of reflection that will lead to further insight. So there's a dimension of reader response that can be beneficial. Where it can be very shaky is when it relies so much on individualistic interpretation and not giving primacy to the capability of the text to actually have objective meaning. Next, we take up what's known as deconstruction. Once again, I refer you to page 128 with the little cliff notes there, defining deconstruction as follows. It seeks to show how all texts deconstruct or undermine themselves. Texts make no absolute claims on readers. And now on page 131, we want to be aware that behind this deconstruction movement is Friedrich Nietzsche and a famous figure, follower of his, Jacques Derrida. Notice this statement in that bottom paragraph 131. All texts, indeed all human communication, ultimately deconstructs or undermines itself. And then T.K. Seung's statement. The avowed purpose of the deconstruction approach is generating conflicting meanings from the same text and playing those meanings against each other. Here's how it looks, as you can see in 132, in the story of Esther. We have the statement, it's intriguing to read how Esther, in essence, has to so-called lose her Jewishness in order to save it. if we were to look at the surface message of the book, it's rescuing, protecting the Jewish people who are exiles. And yet, as Esther undertakes that, her avenue in is initially by not publicizing the fact that she's Jewish. So she then has to cover her Jewishness for a period of time until she comes forth and says, you know, the people that are about to be slaughtered are my people. And she acknowledges this to her husband, the king. My personal take on this is that where there is quite evident tension within the text, and notice that's critical, where to deny tension within the text, where to deny that there seems to be one message saying one thing and then some other clues that seem to undermine that, okay, if that's really in the text, we should acknowledge that. We should shine a light on that. But if we approach the text saying, I'm pretty sure I operate from the assumption that it doesn't mean what it says, and I'm going to be the detective that's going to prove that true, that's hazardous. That's going to give me an agenda driving into the text to overturn it, to deconstruct it. I was trying to think what would be another example other than Esther. How about from the book of Ruth? And here what I'm thinking of is effectiveness of a character as analogous to having, and I'll use the word power. Power not in the sense of domineering, but power to get the job done, power to take care of yourself. When we first meet Ruth, she is without resource, so weak, she is powerless, right? She is widowed. She's arriving with Naomi into Israel as a foreigner. Her mother-in-law Naomi is widowed. So in terms of power, and here we're not talking about ability to domineer, but the ability to take care of oneself and have a safe and sustained life, my goodness, she's incredibly under-resourced. But as you watch the story, you realize, wait, she's not so weak as we thought. She takes advantage of the wisdom that Naomi gives her at strategic points. She takes charge of things that she can take charge of, like working diligently in the field. And lo and behold, this comes on the radar of a wealthy farmer who happens to be a short-tail relative to Naomi. And she winds up as this hero, feminine, a heroine of the story. She's a mighty figure. She is a matriarch. So at the end of the story, if you look back and say, was Ruth powerless? Was she ineffective? No, she was very effective. Now, where is God in the story? That's the theological piece is very important too. This is an account of someone in the lineage we find out eventually of King David, and eventually, of course, of the Messiah, Jesus. And the sense of God caring for what he wants to get done, caring for people, is kind of laced through there too, although it's more subtle. Similarly, actually, in the book of Esther. So with Ruth, we might, in a valuable way, put on the lenses of deconstruction and say, what looked initially very, very weak, turns out this book is giving us a message of this woman having great resource and strength and divine care providing for her as she exercises what initiative she can have, what she can control. All that to say, when tension, or shall we say discordant messages, saying one thing and then seemingly saying the opposite, are present within a text, that's immensely valuable to listen to. It can actually crack open sometimes a major, if not the major theme of a passage and really help us see what's going on. But on the other hand, we shouldn't just march into a text saying, I'm much smarter than it's a little bit arrogant, isn't it? I'm much smarter than the text. I know that there's going to be some undermining going on, and it's just up to me, the great literary detective, through deconstruction to uncover it. That's not a good way to go.